Today we're talking about Malice, an item that some of you probably hardly even remember because there was really not much of a point in using it. I've always been a big fan of this item, I've talked about this item a lot, but for most guys it's just not really been the most justifiable choice. That may or may not change now, and that's what we're going to look into today. We're going to look at two parts here, the more mathematical part, especially regarding ADCs, as well as more of a feels part for assassins especially. Now, why are we looking into Malice at this point? Because Malice was changed in the most recent patch. Half of you probably already forgot that, and I can't blame you. It's just an item that kind of falls under the table. But the change was very drastic. The reasoning here from Hi-Rez was as follows. Malice encourages a unique playstyle focused on weaving abilities and critical strikes to gain a benefit. The cost of Malice as well as the strength of the benefit made it difficult to really go for the style of play over the more traditional builds. We are lowering the cost and upping the cooldown reduction to make this more comparable to other build choices. Decreased the cost from 3,000 to 2,650. That's a solid reduction of 350 gold. And increased the cooldown reduction from 2 seconds to 3 seconds. And just in case you don't remember that part, the passive works as follows. You hit an enemy with a critical strike and that then subtracts the cooldown from all your abilities that are currently on cooldown except your ultimate. So if you crit at the start of a fight, it doesn't really do much for you, but if you used a few abilities and you crit then, that is going to be beneficial as it subtracts 3 seconds from these cooldowns right away. Doesn't work for the ult, so that's not really an ult reducing tool, but for the rest of your kit. This effect has an internal cooldown of 5 seconds, meaning you can't just crit over and over and reduce all your cooldowns to 0. The item also comes with 40 physical power, which is okay for that price, but there is better when you're looking for raw damage output, but then also 25% critical strike chance, which is really high for that price level. Rage, for example, comes with a slightly higher crit chance of 30% and a slightly lower price tag of 2,400 gold, but only half the physical power and a passive that only works towards more crit. So as usual, I went ahead and did some tests, and in this particular case I wanted to do a test that can somewhat measure the DPS output changes with Malice, which is not that easy to do, but I somewhat found a way. So the guard that I used here was Medusa, with a relatively cooldown reduction focused build, because I like Medusa with a more cooldown focused playstyle while still implementing decent enough typical hunter items to make her work DPS wise. So the build that I used here was Transcendence for high power and cooldown reduction, Ninja Tabai for a bit of attack speed that way, Jotun's Wrath for a lot of cooldown reduction as well as some flat penetration, the Executioner for some protection reduction as well as more attack speed, then Rage to get sufficient crit procs in the first place, and then in one situation Malice for the additional reduction, or Deathbringer for just higher crit damage. It's not the super typical ADC build, but it will still work decently. If you have your 1 active, your steroid active, you get to 2.4 attack speed, so if you don't want to overcap, you don't even want to have much more attack speed with Medusa anyways. But we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. Let's first look at what numbers we got out of this. So what I did with this build is I pre-stacked some shots on an Odin bot to get the max values for crit damage and for non-crit damage. Of course, you can also factor in the damage before that when it's not fully stacked, but in the context of what we're testing here, that is not very relevant. What is relevant is the max damage numbers. With Malice, a crit will deal 492 damage. A non-crit will deal 246 damage. With Deathbringer, a crit will deal 566 damage, while a non-crit normal attack will once again deal 246 damage. So in that regard, you get more damage out of Deathbringer as the passive, of course, amplifies the crit here. The crit chance in both cases is the same, with 65% with a fully stacked Rage. Now you can of course create different conditions here. You could have more crit chance if you trade out your boots in late game, you could have less crit chance if you don't have the Rage stacks. But at the end of the day, as long as you have 2 crit items, you will get Malice passive and Deathbringer's passive often enough, so not to worry about that. Now factoring the average damage against the crit chance, we have a average basic attack damage of 406 for Malice and of 454 for Deathbringer. The attack speed in both cases without any effects is 1.64, and with an attack speed steroid from the 1 it is 2.4. Keep in mind that technically the effect of the 1 is for 5 basic attacks if you attack cancel properly. I, in this calculation, assumed that it's going to be for 4 basic attacks. Maybe you don't attack cancel quite right, or you miss a basic or something, so it feels a little bit more fair and a bit more realistic. The resulting DPS values are 666, the number of the devil for Malice, and 745 for Deathbringer. And that's without the attack speed steroid. With the steroids, it's 974 for Malice and 1090 for Deathbringer. And now for the really interesting part. If you use the one at the start of the fight, the Viper shot, then if you have Malice, after roughly 10 shots you will have another Viper shot. Whereas with Deathbringer, it's quite a few shots later. And this is interesting because this means at this point we can kind of measure a DPS difference through an additional Viper shot in one case through the Malice passive versus not getting the additional shot through Deathbringer. And this is where I made a little bit of a mistake in my calculations yesterday, which is why this video is coming out 1 day later than planned, because I wanted to redo them so you have the correct values. But that's what I did. And now we have the actual results. So in order to compare the damage output here, I had to do multiple steps. The first thing that I had to measure was how much time it takes to do 14 shots with the Deathbringer build. We just use Viper shot once. So you have that for 4 shots. Technically you'd have it for a little bit more, but 4 shots is guaranteed at least. And then you also have your additional basic attacks with the slower attack speed, with the 1.64 attack speed. So a total of 14 shots, 4 of them being at 2.4 attack speed, would be 7.76 seconds. And this is the value that we need on the other side now, because on the other side, we will be able to use Viper shot twice within these 14 shots. That means out of the 14 shots, 8 shots are with 2.4 attack speed and the rest is with 1.64. In this case, the time for 14 shots is 6.99 seconds. So what we can see here is we have a little more than half a second difference for these shots. With the normal attack speed that we have here, not the amplified one, an additional shot would take 0.6 seconds at 1.64 attack speed. Or in other words, because we have Viper shot twice, we get an additional basic attack here. The total damage output after that is 6,089 for Malice and 6,356 for Deathbringer. So in terms of just the raw damage, it's in favor of Deathbringer. However, we also have to factor in the Viper shot damage. Across all the ticks of Viper shot, that is 516 damage in this case. This additional damage is now added once to your Deathbringer damage output for a total of 6,872. In Malice's case, we have to add this damage twice because we use Viper shot twice. And the total damage here is 7,120.5 in the exact same time frame for both attacks here. And keep in mind, the numbers here would be under very ideal circumstances because you'd have to have really quick shots and land all of them. But even if you don't land all shots at all times, this doesn't significantly change. You'd have to miss a lot of shots to actually lose out in terms of damage output with Viper shot, and missing shots actually favors Malice in other ways with the cooldown reduction as well. So very, very interesting results here. And that's still not all, because we also have to factor in that the cooldown reduction doesn't just affect the 1. So outside of Viper shot, we of course have Medusa's 2 as well, which deals 260 damage in this situation. Now I don't want to include this more than once because I think that would just be a bit too optimistic, but there are many situations where you will be able to use the 2 again earlier. And not only that, you may also be able to use your escape again earlier, which I think is super, super important. So there's a lot of additional potential that you can get from Malice's effect outside of just having higher DPS in this particular situation. What I will say on the other hand is that it will require some practice with Malice to keep track of all your cooldowns at all times. Because right now you have a general feeling of how long your cooldowns are just from using them, and you don't necessarily always have to look down at them, but now you will have to keep closely tracking them, and you can't go by feeling because they could immediately be reduced at any point. And that is a completely different playstyle, and I noticed this for example with Set, where you have to focus a lot more on the abilities, that it can be a bit more stressful to play a character that way. So that's worth keeping in mind over a very relaxed playstyle as an ADC where you just hold left mouse basically and get your damage off. But if you're into that, just to min-max that way or just to use your abilities more, this could definitely be for you. And by the way, my build style wasn't even necessarily favorable here. If I was focusing on other things instead of CDR, then Malice would be able to proc twice, because the base cooldown for Viper Shot is 10 seconds and the internal cooldown for Malice is 5 seconds, meaning you would actually get the double reduction in the duration of the ability. So it can be very interesting to bounce around different build ideas in this context as well, or maybe get more crit chance or more pen in other ways. Many options, and I think that's very interesting and makes this a very unique playstyle and build. If you're playing a god that can utilize Malice, you have to use your abilities super early in the fight so that they're on cooldown, so that the cooldown can get reduced in the first place, something that most players aren't exactly used to. So very different playstyle, very different effect, but similar damage output for a significantly cheaper price. 350 gold, at least in mid-game, still has an impact. At some point in late game, it doesn't matter that much anymore. Now, of course, it doesn't work as well for every god as it does for Medusa necessarily. If you are less ability reliant, gets less benefit from that, then it's maybe not as useful. At the same time, it could be interesting to see what impact it has for gods like, for example, Ram, who gets a massive attack speed steroid as well, where maybe through the attack speed steroid you could still get a higher damage output. I think overall this is very cool, and what's also worth keeping in mind is that we have a leaked item from the new item tree that will potentially come out that way, which comes with 20% cooldown reduction and crit chance. And that means this item would be a super strong combination with Malice to reduce your cooldowns without having to go into an item like Jotun's Wrath for that. We'll see what downsides this item has and if it will actually get released in the current form, but at least it's right now called a bow of something, so it's probably gonna work for hunters, and that's a good start. But I've only talked about hunters so far, and I think some other gods are also worth mentioning that I toyed around with a little bit. I think this item is interesting, to say the least, for Naja. With Naja, the biggest problem is that you have to use your abilities before you actually go into the ult to get the full benefit of the cooldown reduction here, because if you ult early in a fight, then you get less benefit in terms of the reduction from the other things. It's cool if you use your 1 and then maybe your 3 to follow up, or your 2-3 to follow up, and then you ult someone, then you can actually force a cooldown reduction just because you have a guaranteed crit. So you will have all your abilities reduced, and that can feel nice. But at the same time, again, it forces a very different playstyle, and in Naja's case, I gotta say, it feels a little bit awkward sometimes. I also tried doing this with a Willish because she's this kind of god who utilizes hybrid styles, but with her the problem was that often I would simply use my 3 maybe only and then use basics to get the amplified feather step, and in that moment I could already get the crit, and then the whole benefit for feather step was basically already ruined. Another god where this item should be somewhat interesting with is Serket, but there are some problems with that. Because with Serket, your 1 is what you use to proc crits, and that means that that's your only chance to really get the resets, because you won't use many basic attacks unless you have 3 poisons anyways. And the issue is that if you use the 1 and you crit during the 1, then the cooldown for the 1 itself will not be reduced, because that's only applied after the ability finishes. So in most situations you'll probably just reduce your 2 or maybe your 3 and 2, and that doesn't really increase your damage output that much, even though it gives you a little bit of survivability in some ways. But I think that makes it less worth considering for Serket than for some other gods. Even for Mercury, who usually utilizes crit items quite well, I'm not quite sure if that's the right choice, because with him you just want to quick burst enemies with your basics, and Malice doesn't really help much there. You probably have to look to slightly more unconventional picks that typically don't utilize crit in the assassin department if you really want to see some benefit from this. A guard that could, for example, make use of this is Arachne if you use her 1 early in the fight for a secondary 1, which could be absolutely disgusting. Maybe Bakasura for additional Butcher Blades. Honbats could still kind of work, even though, depending on when you get the crit, it can be more or less beneficial. If you get it early after your first ability, then it's not that nice. It could, for example, also work for Loki. It could somehow work for even Raven if you use the 1 early, or it could work for Pelé. Outside of Hunters, I think this is an item you have to look at more as a CDR item that works a little bit weirdly and therefore doesn't work well for everyone, with additional crit as a benefit for, you know, some hard-hitting basics with a bit of luck. That's not the thing that we typically see at the moment, and many games are also too short to actually utilize it yourself, but it can be an interesting option. A Raven chaining his 1 twice after each other just sounds pretty scary in many situations. And again, we will see what the new item brings in this regard as well, if this helps this kind of playstyle further. I would not be surprised at this point if somebody finds a playstyle, especially for Hunters, to implement this on a regular basis. A guard that unfortunately doesn't work as well as many people would think with this is Ullr, because it will only reduce his cooldowns in 1 stance, and I think otherwise he would pretty much be the best guard for this item, but like this, it's solid still, but not insane at least. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to sub button and with the bell, it helps me out. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to click the like button. See you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.